Take you live now to Constitutional Hill in Braamfontein, Johannesburg this Freedom Day, where Peter Ndoro is standing by. Hello again, Peter. You really are at a site in our country that truly encapsulates the story of the triumph of the human spirit.
Kirshni, thanks very much. Kirshni, thanks very much indeed. And yeah, we are at Constitution Hill, and it's what's good to see on this Freedom Day actually is the number of visitors that have come to get a sense of what this place represents and in the history of South Africa. And these are visitors from both South Africa and from further afield as visitors from other countries. And if you want to have an understanding of the challenges that millions of South Africans went through, this is a great place to come and see just some of the conditions that they went through. And of course, they were fighting for human rights, weren't they? This was the big thing that South Africans wanted to experience and enjoy. And 25 years on, we're going to take a look and see where we are along the human rights journey. And to help us unpack that, I'm now joined by the communications coordinator at the South African Human Rights Commission, Gershwell Brooks. Gershwell, thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Good afternoon to you, Peter, and of course the people watching.
All right, so your institution does important work looking at the human rights situation in the country. And some people might say that, you know, since the advent of democracy, you shouldn't have so much to do. So tell us, 25 years on, kind of what's the journey for us as South Africans looking at human rights?
I think the most important thing is obviously to recognize the fact that there's a massive leap that we've taken in the last 25 years from where we were under apartheid and colonialism to where we are today, where people actually can speak about human rights and having those rights, and that those rights are available to all in South Africa. I think the other thing to recognize is, of course, that we have civil political rights on the one end, and those are rights that you can realize immediately. And hence, the 27th of April is such an important date, because back in 1994, on this very date, all South Africans had the opportunity to vote, whereas they couldn't do that prior to that. So that was a right that you could immediately roll out. But many other rights are progressively realizable, especially socio-economic rights. Now, I think there needs to be some recognition that a lot more could have been done to ensure that those rights are implemented and that people have access to those rights. But we should also recognize at the very same time that there are certain constraints, whether they be economic, whether they be capacity constraints. But that is exactly what the South African Human Rights Commission is there to do. We have a three-pronged mandate, and that mandate includes the protection, the promotion, as well as the monitoring of the attainment of those particular rights. So, in other words, we watch and see how how those rights are rolled out.
So, what would you say in the 25 years that have elapsed now have been the biggest challenges that South Africa has had to try and overcome, and perhaps still are big challenges? And I guess these are the things that are coming on your desk all the time.
Well, race definitely remains the leading point of concern around complaints. So we have equality, and equality is obviously broken up into subcategories, including sex, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability, and race. Unfortunately, we find that race is still taking up the largest chunk of complaints that we receive. But I think that it's also important to understand that the racial segregation of the past then bleeds into other rights and how those rights are affected, whether those be socioeconomic rights or any other rights for that matter. So in terms of the racial segregation that we've seen in the past, and that was obviously from the system of governance that we had, it bled through into other spaces, from where people live to where what access people have to transport, to where they work, to the type of education that they receive. And that is exactly what the Bill of Rights aims to do, through those rights that it has given, to equalize as much as possible and to really create an equal society. So equality does remain a major issue, but equality, I think we shouldn't just understand from a very narrow perspective, where someone calls one person by a particular name that can be construed as hate speech, but it actually goes much further. The type of, the excess of, the quality of water that you have, the type of food that you eat, the type of home that you live in, what type of education your children have.
It's interesting you say quality of food and equality, and we're at Constitution Hill. And when we look at what's behind me here, they talk about the different types of food that the prisoners here had, whether you were white, whether you were black, and the different kinds of experiences that they had. And it's interesting that this should have all died, but in many ways, years later, we're still struggling with different types of inequality because some people can only afford a certain type of diet and others pretty much carte blanche to eat whatever they want.
No, very true, and it's very sad to see that it was a sanctioned system whereby something as simple and as basic as dried beans was a commodity, or the access to meat. Those three pots that are outlined there: Congress 1, Congress 2, and Congress 3, where it was good meat, sort of discarded meat, and then nothing else but no, not even bones. It's either just porridge or mealies. And unfortunately, that's a reality for a lot of people, and that is what they, and that is unfortunately what they survive on. That's what they live on, and it's something that's absolutely shocking and that needs to change. But that is exactly the point of it all, isn't it? That I think that the last 25 years have shown us that this is a work in progress, and yes, there is an admission, and I think that government, civil society, faith-based organizations, other Chapter 9 institutions, society, as ordinary members of society ourselves, we should admit that there's a lot more that we can do in making sure that we realize those rights.
How do you get a society to eat from a better pot than before?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that is definitely a major threat to our democracy, our constitutional democracy, and the rights that I think we all understand how corruption has played a major role in the denial of rights to people, whereas people were fleecing and stealing money rather than using that money to deliver on those particular rights that are so essential. Another serious concern for the South African Human Rights Commission is obviously the level of violence that we are seeing, in particular violence being directed towards women and children, but also generally within society. I mean, you're very well aware that in the lead up to these elections, as robust as the political debate and discourse has been, we have seen incidents of violence, we've seen incidents of protest action that has turned nasty. And the key question is, do we understand we need to be very jealous and guard this very delicate constitutional democracy that we have, especially leading up to the 8th of May elections, which are just days away.
So the next parliament is going to come. If you could address parliament, the new parliament when it sits, what would you, from a South African Human Rights Commission point of view, be telling them that they need to prioritize and get right?
I think that the South African Human Rights Commission holds out that Parliament should play its role and its function as an oversight body over many of the various institutions that we see, including the Commission. But at the very same time that we need to always have a rights-centered approach. So in other words, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution should always hold the highest authority when making decisions. And I think that that's lacking, not just and I'm not talking about Parliament specifically, but I think in many spaces that we tend to forget about the importance of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the rights that are placed in it within the Bill of Rights, and ensuring that we attain those particular rights.
Gershwin Brooks, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much. All the best.
Okay, so that was Gershwin Brooks, who is the communications coordinator at the South African Human Rights Commission, sharing his thoughts with us, and that whilst some of the challenges that we faced in the past may have been dealt with, there's still so many that we need to manage and deal with in terms of equality. And some of the challenges that we faced over time has been about caused by rather things like corruption. And to talk to us a little bit about that now is David Lewis, who's at Corruption Watch. Dave, thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
All right, so we've just been talking to the South African Human Rights Commission, and they said that some of the challenges that the people of South Africa have faced have been as a result of things like corruption. And I just wonder if you could piece together for us the relationship between democracy and corruption.
There's a very strong negative correlation between democracy and corruption, and not only in South Africa, all over the world. And so the weaker the democracy, the stronger corruption will be, the more extensive corruption will be, and the more extensive corruption is, the weaker the democracy will be. And we've seen it here, in the infamous state capture episode involving the Gupta and Zuma families. This wasn't simply a series of bribes paid to procurement officers. In order to cover up the corruption, in order to extend it, the president's appointment powers had to be abused. Parliament had to be weakened. The National Prosecuting Authority had to be gutted. The African National Congress had to be enormously undermined in order to ensure that the Zuma part of the conspiracy was kept in power. And then, at a much more ground level, we've seen how school governing bodies, for example, have had to be compromised in order for corruption at that level to take place. Local government is another instance. And so there is a very strong relationship. And ultimately what it emerges as, in the end, is a remarkable level of distrust that the public have in their public officials and in their political representatives. And that's can never be good for a democracy. In fact, it's very difficult for a democracy to sustain itself when people believe that nothing good will come of those that they elect, of their police who are appointed to look after them rather than to abuse them. And so there's a very strong relationship, and we've really seen that playing out in South Africa, particularly over the last 10, 15 years. But, the arms deal was, another example of where institutions had to be weakened in order to cover it up.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of people talk about the recent years of corruption and state capture and so on and so forth. If we go back to 1994, were we perhaps a little naive in the way that we approached it? We had lots of warnings from other countries on the continent of what could happen. Could we have been better prepared for the next 25 years that unfolded? Because these things don't happen overnight.
We could have been. It's often said about the Constitution is that certain critical clauses of the Constitution were put in place with the best possible president in mind instead of the worst possible president in mind. And so the appointment powers that the president has, for example, really need to be reviewed. That was the principal instrument that he used in order to affect the process of state capture. But, I think mostly what happened in 1994 was not that we were naive, and I certainly count myself in this. We thought we had gotten the government that we wanted, and we went to sleep. Some of us went into business, others, like me, went into government. We left the unions, we left civil society organizations. The unions got into bed with the governing party, and we landed up with the government that we deserved. And that, I think, is the lesson. A government is good as its people are demanding. And we must know that today when, we've got a hard road to traverse still. But, I'm happy to say I feel much more optimistic and positive about the future now than I did, say, 18 months ago. But if we relax our vigilance, we will land up in exactly the same hole that we landed up in 29. So yeah, maybe naivety, maybe exhaustion, maybe just sheer delight at, as I say, having gotten the government that we wanted. But vigilance, whether you're in Sweden or Somalia, you have to be vigilant if you want a government that will serve your needs rather than its own needs.
And so there are a lot of people who are non-partisan at the moment. Perhaps that's a good thing, we're not sure. But there's a lot of people who are not sure that they're even going to vote. And if there's a relationship between democracy and corruption, then we must vote.
Absolutely, but I think, that goes to the point earlier made, is that people are not going to vote because they've become enormously cynical and enormously skeptical of the political class. I think we've all experienced that. This is a phenomenon across the board. I mean, I'm constantly asked who I'm going to vote for, and to give advice to people, not that they should ask me because I don't know the answer, who they should vote for. But it does go to, and as I say, an enormous distrust in the political class. And it's important that it be overcome, but then it's important that the political class deliver on what it is that people are wanting.
You gave us a clue a short while ago in terms of some of the things that the laws that we wrote were written with the best intentions, with a good person in mind. And I just wonder, do we need to sit back and look at our laws based on what's played out and say, look, appointment powers is one thing, but there are other laws that really need to be reviewed?
Yeah, look, I think there are laws. I mean, the procurement laws need to be reviewed. Certainly, as I say, the appointment powers need to be reviewed. There are a range of legal instruments. I mean, we're experiencing at the moment that what South Africans want to see above all, and this is, I think, an absolute prerequisite for restoring trust in government, is they want to see individual perpetrators punished. And, these are difficult things to hurry along, and the institution, two of the institutions that were arguably most destroyed in the state capture period were the National Prosecuting Authority, South African Revenue Services. Now, those two organizations get together. In fact, I'm just hearing today that South African Revenue Services are moving against Bosasa, infamously involved in the scandal. But it's the old Al Capone story. You couldn't get him on murder. You got him on tax evasion. And if you can't prosecute an enormously complex sort of cross-border flow of money laundering crime, look if they've filed their taxes and if they've evaded their taxes, because I think people really want to see individuals going to jail. And the NPA and SARS have also got a big hole to climb out of. But I think they really need to prioritize particular individuals and particular crimes and go after them, like terriers. That's really, I think, what needs to be done most immediately.
All right. So a lot of the times, people put up numbers, billions stolen and so on and so forth. I wonder if you could give us a sense of what corruption has cost South Africa in terms of maybe, there's this level of unemployment, schools that are not built. How bad has it been in terms of where we could have been?
It's very difficult to put a rand and cents number to it. I mean, you can look at individual particular cases of corruption. I mean, look at Eskom. I mean, the situation in Eskom is not only a product of corruption, but it's very substantially a function of corruption. Look at what that is costing the economy. I mean, not only, in direct rands and cents terms, but in the confidence of investors in the economy. So the cost has been enormous. But I repeat, the principal cost has been in the lack of trust between the public and their representatives. When the public believe that the president has made a proposal to split up Eskom in order to sell it to his brother-in-law, we're in trouble. I mean, that anybody could make that up is extraordinary to me. But that people actually believe it is a sign of real mistrust. And if we're to get out of this hole, we've got to review our policies, we've got to review our practices, and we've got to extend some good faith to those who are making the proposals, instead of saying immediately what everybody is saying is what is in it for him or her. And that's the level to which we've descended. And government have to do something to get us out of that situation. As I say, prosecuting perpetrators is one of them. Fixing up the healthcare system. I mean, if just resources were placed on doing something that people would visibly identify as the sort of government that they want to see, and health I mean, education is a really tough one. But, when I see the volume of reports that we're getting about corruption in the healthcare system, and, these are not necessarily big. It's, the gogo who's got to pay a bribe in order to get her place in the queue to have her prescription filled. It's that kind of thing needs to be really stamped upon. And that will start to restore faith in government and trust in government, but it must never relax our vigilance. That's what I think.
And also, I guess, citizens have to play their part. But there's this thing, I'm scared to speak because there's not a great history of protection of whistleblowers.
Yeah, a lot of people talk about what has saved us, and people point to civil society and media and the courts. I think what has saved us is that South Africans have refused consistently to accept that this is what they have to accept. So they haven't. We haven't remained quiet. You go to a lot of countries, Russia, other countries like that. I mean, people have just, this is a tax, a very big tax they have to pay, and there's nothing that can be done about it. South Africans are a more sort of, unruly, ungovernable bunch, and thank God for that. But so I think that's one thing that's held us in good stead. And, now it needs to be harnessed in a productive way. I mean, it can't be harnessed by, burning down schools and some of the only ways that people have had to express themselves in the past, and I think still feel the only ways that they have to express themselves. And as I say again, government has got to demonstrate that that's not the only way to persuade them to do what is right.
David, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks so much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us. And I think a very important point that there is this important relationship between democracy and corruption, and that we must remain vigilant as we go forward. Thanks so much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Thanks very much.
So that was David Lewis from Corruption Watch sharing his thoughts with us about the last 25 years, and that we've got the right institutions, we've got the right laws, but we can't fall asleep on the job. We have to be activists and make sure that our hard-won democracy is protected, and it starts with you and I as the citizens. Let's go back to studio, but we'll have more for you from Constitution Hill after